It's 7 o'clock. My name is Peter Fraser. I'm the director of recruitment at Historic St. Mary's City. Thank you for coming to our fall musical venue lecture series. In a different venue for every lecture so far. It's our last one. But before I bring on Dr. Miller to introduce our speaker, just wanted to quick housekeeping. First, cell phones, you have them. Please put them on silence. That vibrates. That would be helpful. And a reminder: this is we're winding down at Historic St. Mary's City for our open season. We'll be open Friday and Saturday this week, and then next week we have special holiday hours. We're only open Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday of next week. And Friday and Saturday is a great program. If you've never been out for Hearth and Home, where we do cooking at all the living history sites, when you come, you'll get a recipe book that teaches you how to do it the 17th century method. And then we also convert it to a modern kitchen so you can try the recipe or the receipt, as they would have called it back then. And it's really fun. And or if you have in-laws and you're sick of them and you need somebody, you can give them to us. If you need to burn some calories and walk around, you can come visit us. So, other than that, we will then be opening in mid-March of next year. So without further ado, Henry?
Okay, thank you very much there. Well, happy to see everybody here. My privilege tonight to talk about our speaker, Dr. Dennis Pogue. Dennis is a native of Iowa, but like me in the 1970s, he came to the Chesapeake and found the area so fascinating that he never left, basically. Dennis came to dig with us. He worked on the Van Speringen site at Chancellor's Point, other sites in St. Mary's, as well as in Virginia. And 1983, he became the Southern Maryland Regional Archaeologist. They were based at Patterson Park, where he was also the director of research. And while there, he led some very significant projects, such as the King's Reach plantation excavation and the first real excavations on the Navy base with the work at Mattaponi, which was quite still a very important site for everybody. In 1987, he became chief archaeologist for George Washington's Mount Vernon Association and rose over the next 25 years to become the director of restoration and finally vice president for restoration. So very important site in our nation's history, obviously. Dennis received his PhD from American University in 1997. And his dissertation is a very significant treatise called Culture Change Along the Tobacco Coast, 1670 to 1720. A very important piece of scholarship. He's also taught stork preservation at Mary Washington College and for a number of years at the University of Maryland's Architecture School, where he retired from in 2021. He's had a long and deep interest in many, many topics and published on many things. Tobacco pipes, he authored a major volume on Chesapeake tobacco pipes. I was able to participate with him on the first study of trade beads in the Chesapeake region, way back in the day there. But many other topics, ceramics, architecture. And one of his many publications, of which it's a very long list, is a particular book entitled Founding Spirits, George Washington and the Beginnings of the American Whiskey Industry. Received a number of awards, and being a fan of whiskey, I thought it was a great study. His interest in architecture has also been very long, deep, and enduring. And now he has turned to the subject of tonight's talk. Dennis is president of Virginia Slave Housing, an organization focused on the very significant topic of how the enslaved people of this region lived and the types of dwellings that they inhabited. What he is finding is exceptionally significant adding to our knowledge in ways we had not perhaps anticipated. And it's so fascinating that it is my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight to tell us of his findings, Dr. Dennis.
Thank you, Henry. Gee whiz, there's some things there that I had forgotten. You always learn a lot when you come to these programs, and even when you're the speaker. First of all, I would like to thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Peter and Ruth and Henry, for inviting me to come and speak. I'll also say that I had a great day today. Ruth, I was in the capable hands of Ruth Mitchell and her very excellent staff. And so we went around and looked at several of the excavations that are going on today, some of which I had worked at a long time ago, and I had sort of forgotten that I had. So it was sort of old home week again in that regard. So anyway, so thanks a lot. So tonight I'm going to talk about this project that Henry referenced that's been going on for quite a while. Really began in 2005. And my colleague, I have to mention, Doug Sanford, and I have been working on this since that time. So this is kind of going to be a survey, a summary a little bit of some of our findings, and that will include sort of content of the types of buildings that are out there. It's also very preservation related. So we began this project partly because we didn't know how many buildings were still out there that were associated with the enslaved. And we're sort of happy to report that there's more than we had anticipated. But on the other hand, they're going fast, and there are several that we've recorded over the years that no longer survive. And it's kind of grim for buildings that really have very little purpose, and for many property owners who don't really see the value of maintaining them. On the other hand, there are some great folks out there who own these buildings and who value them highly and have done a lot of work to preserve them. So that's kind of the story. We started off with, this is a quotation from Dell Upton, that slaves lived in houses of many sizes and varied quality. And we're going to talk quite a bit about that tonight, about why that is. And commented that the buildings that survive, they misrepresent the norm because of the preservation bias associated with these buildings. And so that was sort of the starting point for our project, was how many buildings are out there, how can we document them, and how do we understand them in the broader context of slavery in the Chesapeake. So our project is on Virginia, and so most of what I talk about is about Virginia, but because I'm in Maryland, we'll talk about that a little bit as well, and draw some comparisons and some contrasts between what's going on between the two states divided by the Potomac River. So talking about the goals of the project: research, preservation, and education. So to identify and document as many slavery-related structures as we could, and make the data readily available. And so for all of our property owners, we make it clear to them that we're going to publish this information. And for some property owners, there's a little bit of trepidation about that. It's a fraught topic, and some folks who own these buildings, are leery of any publicity about that. Foster awareness of their significance. By telling folks that we think these buildings are important, hopefully they believe us, and they will be more committed to their preservation. And then promote educational opportunities. That these buildings should not be, viewed as just buildings on the landscape with no real purpose. They have educational value, and over the time period, as we've seen, larger political issues in this country and questions about diversity, we feel now more than ever that these are important buildings, and they reflect a period of our past that is a dark period, but they also tell a positive story, because any building that housed slaves and still survives has been around for 160 years after slavery. So they've gone through, various stages, and they have stories to tell that are much broader than just the specific aspect, of the slavery period. So, oops, I forgot to mention, I'm required to mention NEH Collaborative Research Grant number RZ50619-06, because we got a research grant to start this project back in 2007 to support a 2-year sort of trial project, and so I need to acknowledge them. And also I want to point out virginiaslavehousing.umd.edu. That is the web page. So if you're interested in learning more about these buildings and about this project, you can just go to that web page, and you will find biographies of about 60 of the 123 buildings that we've studied so far. And then you'll find a database that has all sorts of pointy-headed information about all the different buildings. So if you are interested in researching and looking at comparison with slave buildings, then this is a place for you to go. So let's start at the beginning. How many were there and how many survive? So one of our best sources of information is the 1860 U.S. Census, Schedule number 2 on slave inhabitants. And this was the first and only time that the census recorded buildings, and this is what they referred to them as slave housing. So the census is, as it suggests, they list the enslaved at given properties, and then they also added the number of buildings. And so this is our best source of information that we have to get anything like a global sense of how many of these buildings could have been out there. So we've gone through the schedule. Doug Sanford has primarily done this work, so I need to acknowledge that, and have gone through 36 counties and tabulated all of these buildings, and that's the number, 38,000. Also 8 cities. We've looked at cities and come up with another 3,500. So that's about 1,000 structures per county. And if you estimate, or if you just do the math for the 99 counties and 8 cities in present-day Virginia, you come up with in excess of 100,000 structures. 100,000 structures. And we believe that these were primarily standalone buildings. So enslaved folks lived in a variety of places, as we'll discuss. Some of them were standalone, i.e. that's all they served. They were housing for the enslaved. But there were many other buildings where these folks lived. Mixed-use buildings like kitchens and laundries and places like that oftentimes had slave quarters attached to them. And then particularly in large houses, substantial estates, they may have a wing, a service wing on the back of the house. And in urban situations, they would even oftentimes have them living in the attic, or the basement. And so none of those places probably were enumerated in this census. So I think that the 110,000 number is actually likely an undercount of the number of buildings that would have been there. So how many survive? So this is the difficult question, but going to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources inventory. So these are buildings that over the years folks have identified as slave quarters or slave buildings, and you see the number there. And so it's a total of maybe 500 or so buildings on this inventory. That, we believe, is an overcount, because some of this work was done in the 1970s, 1980s, and so the identification of a slave building is pretty suspect. We've shown this to be the case by going out and looking at a number of these buildings, and it was not a slave building. And of course, that's the first question that you have to address. Was it really? So of those numbers, we think that's almost certainly an overcount. So it's an undercount of the buildings that were out there originally, and an undercount of what we think, was there. So, just doing the math, it's like 1 or 2% of the slave buildings that were in existence in 1860 may survive today. So that just shows us, what the situation is. So I've mentioned before already that enslaved folks lived in a variety of buildings. So one of the first rules here, or first things that we go by, is that enslaved folks tended to live where they worked. So if they were working in the field, if they were field hands, and of course Virginia was overwhelmingly an agricultural colony with first tobacco and then other crops dominating, then they would live near where they work, which is the fields. And so we find this to be the case. So the field hands are living in outlying quarters. Then there's the rest of the enslaved community. So that includes domestic servants, folks who were living in and around the main house, cooks and seamstresses and various kinds of folks, and artisans and craftspeople. So craftspeople, blacksmiths and coopers and weavers and a whole variety of other duties that these folks performed, and they also tended to live where they worked. So you have this sort of a hierarchy in terms of skills and also a geographical distribution on where they tended to live and to work. Family groups became in the Chesapeake. One of the things about Chesapeake slavery that's different from slavery in many other parts of the world is that family groups became very important. And natural reproduction became the method by which slave population increased in the Chesapeake, pretty early on. Unlike, other parts, especially if you contrast this with the Caribbean and South America, where the life expectancy of enslaved folks was lower because of the brutality of the system. So in the Chesapeake, families had a chance to develop. And over time, these family groups tended to be one of the basic units that we find living in these enslaved areas. Now, that doesn't mean the Chesapeake slaveholders were benevolent, nice guys. They were profit-driven, just like everybody else. And they felt nothing about separating families if they needed to, or selling family members as required. So this is not in any way to try to gloss over the realities of a system that was oppressive and deadly, to be quite honest. But family units were important, and so we do see that distributed in the buildings. So to use a very, very well-known example, this is the 5 farms map of Mount Vernon that was developed by George Washington in the 1790s. So in 1799, there were 306 enslaved workers at Mount Vernon. And they incorporated all of the different categories that we've just discussed. So there were field hands, there were artisans, there were specialist workers at the grist mill, at the distillery, et cetera. And so this map, the red circles are showing 4 outlying farms, and then the one at the bottom is the Mansion House farm. So the 4 outlying farms, each one of those has a complex of slave quarters and an overseer's house nearby. There was an overseer, sometimes a white man and sometimes a black man, who were assigned to live there and to oversee the workers that were there. So this shows sort of that distribution of quarters. So we've got them out in these outlying areas. And then at the Mansion House farm, that's where there was a real concentration of enslaved workers who were doing the jobs associated with the main household. So this shows on the lower right, this is a painting from 1793 or so. The mansion is on the left. And then you see 2 buildings on the right. The one with the arrow is for the House for Families, which was a 2-story building. That was a slave quarter. And we don't know much about that because that building was torn down in the 1790s. We excavated the cellar and found a rich diversity of artifacts that we think reflects the fact that this enslaved group was living very near the mansion. And so they were getting hand-me-downs and cast-offs, from the Washington household. So finding sort of remarkably, fine objects there, porcelain and glassware and all of that. So that was where, folks who were living at the mansion house were living. That was torn down and replaced by the one-story wings on either side of the greenhouse. And you can see the one wing here. This is the later greenhouse slave quarter, and there's another one on this side. And this painting was done right at the time that the one building was still there before it came down and after the other one had been erected. So at the Mansion House Farm, there were about 90 enslaved people in 1799. And again, they were divided up among mostly craftspeople and domestic servants. And so they were living, most of them were probably living in those one-story wings. And the picture on the upper left here shows a reconstruction of the space in one of the rooms in one of those wings. So that building was gone and was reconstructed by the ladies in the 1950s. And in 2011, we did research and we restored two of the rooms to appear as we think they did when they were slave quarters. So you see the bunks. So this is kind of a barrack style living situation. So the kind of thing that you do if you're putting up a lot of individuals in a small space. And the folks who are living here, one of the rooms we think was devoted to single women. At least one of them was for single men. And then at least another one of them was for women and children. And so those folks may have had families living elsewhere on the plantation. And in fact, we know that many of them did, because this was the standard operating procedure. More of the artisans were men than women. The seamstresses and weavers would have been women, and so they likely were living here. And then a lot of the men who were other artisans were living here, and they had families that were located in the outlying farms, right? And so, the man is here, his wife and children are living at the outlying farm. And more of the outlying farm slaves were field hands, and they were women. So it's sort of contrary to what we may think is the norm, but that was the case at Mount Vernon and appears to have been the case many other places. So this is an elite plantation. And the reason I show this is because it sort of incorporates most of the different options for housing enslaved folks. Most slaveholders, of course, were not in this situation. The average holding of enslaved folks by a slaveholder in Virginia was 5 people or less. So Washington is up there, over 300. And of course, there are many others very prominent, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and many others who were in that category. But most of the enslaved folks in Virginia were not living in that situation. They were living in a very different, a small farm situation where they may have been one of only 1 or 2 enslaved folks, living, on that site. So all of this is important in terms of where folks are living and what their daily life is like. At Mount Vernon, there's a large enslaved community, so there's lots of opportunities for interaction. There are a lot of families there, so there's a lot of crossover in that way. Other folks who may have been only 1 or 2 of them, they're in a very different social situation as well as everything else. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Slavery, is not one-dimensional. There's a lot going on, and it depends a lot on context. The size of the holding, the wealth of the owner, the location, all of those kinds of things, play a major part in what the physical conditions of these individuals was like. So going back to Mount Vernon, this is on the left a close-up of one of the outlying farms, Union Farm. And you can see here it's very organized. Washington went through a major period of reorganization of the estate, where he moved slave quarters around and reorganized the farms to be more efficient, more productive. And so this is Union Farm. So there's a an agricultural core, and then on a lane not far away, you see the row of 5 slave quarters along the lane, and they're facing a larger building that was the overseer's house. The building on the right is a recreated quarter that we did back in 2007, and it's based on some information, specific information from Mount Vernon, and you can see it's log. And log buildings were by far the most common type of building for slaves in the Chesapeake. And as we'll discuss, even though they were the most common, the preservation bias as such is that they're actually the smallest number that we have found. And this one, we think, is very representative of what one of those outlying quarters would have been. So this is a single quarter. So it's a single room below and another room in the garret. And so this is the kind of space that could have been, housing for, it doesn't have to be families, but by this time at Mount Vernon and throughout the region, family units were sort of were the norm. And so this is the kind of house that an enslaved family could have lived in. Size of buildings. So again, looking at sources of comparison, the Mutual Assurance Society out of Richmond insured buildings, rural buildings between 1796 and 1815. They continued to insure buildings in town after that date. They stopped doing rural buildings. And so by going through those forms, we're able to calculate the sizes of the buildings. So you can see here, they're relatively small when looking at, and they call them Negro quarters. Negro quarter was sort of the typical descriptor of the day for these buildings. So you can see the size of them. On the right is a picture, a drawing from one of the insurance documents that shows a Negro quarter, 25 feet long by 14 feet wide, 1 story, built of stones and covered with wood. So that means that it had a wooden roof over stone walls. And you can see it has chimneys at either end. It doesn't show the doorways, but given the fact of the chimneys at either end, we know that this was a double quarter. And so this would have been for 2 families as opposed to the 1 family, the single quarter that I showed before. All right, documented building. Sweaty Dennis Pogue there in a cellar. So 123 structures recorded so far in 36 counties and 7 towns. So this is the breakdown of the building material. Remember I talked about how log buildings were, we know, the most popular material for quarters. Well, only 17% of the buildings that we have found are log. Frame buildings, 33, brick buildings, 37, stone, 10%. And so, and Pise, which is a very, very rare type of building that actually I'll talk about in a minute, again, a very small number. So, while log was very prevalent, it just doesn't survive. And so why is that? Because, because many of the log buildings are at the outlying quarters. And so after slavery, without the need for housing, enslaved individuals, then why do you need these buildings? And so that is what we have found, is that the survival rate of enslaved court buildings in what would have then been outlying situations is incredibly rare. I mean, we literally have, a handful that we have found. And those are log. To show you that. And so that number should be much, much higher. And so preservation bias, we've got the frame buildings, brick buildings, stone buildings, et cetera. Not only because they're better built, but because most of them are associated with, the sort of the center of the holding. So they're near the planter's house. So after slavery, you don't need slave buildings, but this building near the house is well built and therefore is adaptable for other purposes. So that's what we're finding, is that it's a preservation bias related to material, but even more so, it's related to location and the reason to actually preserve the building. The formats that we found, again, only 22 single cabins, 17%, and then double, and then mixture, and that means mixture is kitchens, laundries, et cetera, that also are serving, as slave quarters. Barracks are like the one at Mount Vernon, where there are multiple, lots of different individuals are living in, a single space in the way that I've shown. So again, a very strong bias here, and that we have every reason to believe that single buildings would have been a much higher percentage of the total than what we have found. So just to sum up the preservation bias, those located near the core of the property are the ones that survive. And they're better built, more resilient, they're larger, and they're more likely then to be adapted for other purposes. So let's see some buildings. Stop talking and let's look at buildings. This is an example of a very prominent plantation in Rappahannock County. And you see here the main house on the lower right. It dates to the 1840s. And you can see it's a very, very prominent, very architecturally sophisticated building. And then across the road, because this is actually the relationship of the building on the right to the buildings on the left. Across the road are these three small brick buildings that were slave quarters. And here you see them here. And they are very architecturally finished. So on the picture on the left, you see that not only are they brick, but the gable end has a parapet wall. The picture on the right is showing a close-up of the mortar joints, which have been penciled with a paintbrush and painted white to make the mortar joints look much straighter and more precise to the eye. And so both of those are things that we see on the main house. So this is an example of the quarters that are near the residence are architecturally mimicking what the planter household is living in. And so we don't have the outlying buildings here, but I would be completely confident that as we moved away from the core of the plantation, it would be the kind of situation we would expect to find elsewhere, that they're not going to be brick, they're not going to have this level of architectural detail that we're seeing here. Looking on the inside, this building has plastered walls, has a wooden floor, has substantial windows that we think are the original size. So all of those are, again, higher level amenities for these buildings. Many of the outlying quarters especially did not have wooden floors. They were earthen floors. And windows oftentimes, especially in log buildings, are very, very small. And then over time, they would be expanded. And plastering, oftentimes the buildings that we see have no evidence of plastering. The walls are exposed, and what they may have had was simply whitewash, to cover that up. On the right here, you're seeing an original intact ladder stair, which is unusual. Haven't found very many of those, leading up into the garret. And in these buildings, like many others, the garret space was available to these folks. It's unheated. Sometimes there are, but most of the time they're not heated, but it's also plastered and has a window. So we're confident that it was at least seasonal living conditions for the folks who were living in this building. And of course, you see the fireplace on the left. So these would be at the upper end in terms of amenities, for these buildings. Changing to another very prominent property. This is Bremo in Fluvanna County, Virginia. This is the property of General John Hartwell Cocke, general in the Revolutionary War, in the War of 1812, who built out this enormous property after he came back from the war. And so this is a plan of the main house, and you can see it's a 5-part plan with large dependencies on either side that are connected with the corridors. So this is a not unusual situation for, again, an elite plantation. The percentage here is of course, remarkably small. Cock was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. So on the left, you see the dependency that has a kitchen and a laundry and a servant's room, and the second floor was quartering spaces. And so this is, again, a not unusual situation for a property, of this type. And so the enslaved folks living there would have been the ones who were working in the kitchen, working in the laundry, and would have been domestic servants, serving the cocks in the main house. The right-hand wing is unusual in that it includes a schoolroom. And Cock had a school set up to educate the children of his enslaved workers. And again, I don't want to make it sound like this guy was, great. He was a capitalist, and he was, out to get everything he could, out of his enslaved folks. But he also was aware that there, were benefits that he would accrue from having an educated, workforce. And so he set up a schoolroom, and he had enslaved women who were the teachers who taught the children. He was also a supporter of Liberia and the American Colonization Society, and so he was a prominent member of that as well. So he was an enslaver, and he had hundreds of slaves and did not free any of them, I think, in his lifetime. But he also exhibited, sort of this level of understanding that that slavery can be beneficial to him, but it also can be ameliorated for his benefit. That also happens to be the benefit, of his workers. In addition to these wings here, there are other buildings to the left, to the east of the kitchen. There's a building I'll talk about in a second, and then there's another building on the right, and then there would have been other quarters for field hands that would have been spreading out, sort of emanating from the main house. And none of those survive, which is the typical situation. Here I want to shout out to folks who've been working on this in one way or another for close to 100 years, who've been documenting historic buildings, and who early on realized that these were important buildings that were not being taken care of, and they were not being documented. This is my personal cultural hero, Francis Benjamin Johnston, who in the 1920s and 1930s took photographs of dozens and dozens and dozens of slave buildings throughout Virginia and Maryland. Not as many, but there are a few in Maryland, and then also in other southern states. And so she started off before the Historic American Building Survey was established. But then when it was established, she was brought on as a staff photographer. So if you go on the HABS webpage, HABS.gov, whatever, and look up, you'll find dozens of her photographs. And they are exquisite, as you can see, large format, black and white images of buildings like this. And this is the Pise, one of the Pise buildings out at Bremo. You can see it's a 2-story building, stone foundation. And Pise is rammed earth. So it's clay that has been rammed into forms to create the walls. And it also it's a mixture of clay, and in some cases it has straw, or other kinds of material that have been put into it. But it was a very popular, well, it wasn't very popular, but it was something that was promoted in the early 19th century as a more efficient and cheaper way of housing workers, both in America and in Europe. And Koch and a few others adopted this and brought this and to their own plantations. So Koch built, we think, according to the records, about 16 of these Pise buildings, of which only 2 survive. And this is one of them, and this is at Upper Bremo. And there's another one in Upper Bremo that I'll show you in a second. This is an unusual building. It's 2 stories. It had 5 separate spaces, 5 separate heated spaces. So, it could accommodate, 5 different households. And it was referred to as the hotel in some of the period documentation. We don't quite know what that means, but it implies certainly multiple occupants that are living here. So this is a Johnston photograph from 1931. This is the second building, PZ building at Upper Bremo, again by Johnston. This is more like a typical quarter that we see. It's a triple. So there is a room on the end with the gable end door providing direct access to that, and then the door on the left going into a room on the left. And then on the back side of this, you can't see it, there's a door in the other gable, and there was an exterior doorway that led up to the garret space that was also heated. So this would have accommodated 3 separate households, giving them each of them direct access to the exterior into the space. And that's really kind of the definition of this, is that the idea is that economically, it was, building a building that had 2 rooms as opposed to 1, made a lot of sense. And so the definition, therefore, is that they're separated spaces, that each household has its own designated space. And in this instance, one of those spaces was in the garret. Both of these buildings survive. This is a picture of that one. It's undergone a lot of restoration back in the 1950s. A lot of work done on it. The roof was replaced, et cetera. The walls are the original walls, although they've been resurfaced here, as you can see. Actually, the hotel that I showed before is much better preserved. We were just there 2 days ago, spent the day, and determined that the flooring, the walls, the doors, the roof, the rafters, all of that is the original material. So that's really, we were blown away. We expected to find, as we had found here, that much of that had been replaced. But no, it is well preserved. So those are really exciting because those are, as far as we know, the only 2 of that building type that survives. And happily, the owners are very committed to their preservation. Places like Bremo, Mount Vernon, others, one of the values of those sites is, of course, the documentation. And they have documentation that often just does not exist, for other properties. So this is one page of a schedule of General Cox servants that was developed. And this goes on and on. There are about 8 pages of this. And they are divided up among families. So let me give you a detail to look at. So this is the 3rd family, and the 3rd family consists of Old Ben, and the next category is where they are located. So UB is Upper Bremo, LB is Lower Bremo, which is another property that's just a couple of miles, away, and it's very clear, and it's also a Cock property. So the enslaved folks, we're going back and forth. And so you'll see here that some of the members of Old Ben's family are living at Lower Bremo. And this is a great little snapshot of a single family. And these are artisans, of course. They're not field hands. So these are the folks that are living, at the main house. So Old Ben is a carpenter. And his location is the shop. Now, does that mean that he's living there or working there or a combination of the 2? We actually don't know. Oh, and by the way, NP or P means professor, and that is professor of Christianity. So NP means that they have not professed, P means that they have professed. And Cock was very concerned about that. So his wife Judy is a cook at the hotel upstairs. Then they've got a child, Jeffrey, who's a carpenter, and he lives in the cellar of George the overseer's house at Lower Bremo. And he's married to Louisa, and she's at Lower Bremo, and she's a field hand, and they have 3 children. And then another son, Anthony, who's a stonemason. So that means he's a very skilled artisan. And he lives in the old peach orchard. I don't know what that means. Presumably it means that there's a quarter building in the old peach orchard where he's living. His wife, Lavinia, she's the school teacher. So she's the one who is teaching in the school in the dependency of the main house. And they have 2 children. And Ned is at school. Jack, a gardener. And he lives in the house east of the kitchen, and that may be the 2-story building that we just showed you, because that's where that is. And there's been other references that suggest that is one way of describing that building. And then it goes down, more children, a carpenter, at the stable, works with his father. Archie and Cyrus appear to be, carpenters who are following in their father's footsteps, which is a typical thing that we see in these kinds of families as well. So a great snapshot, and also shows you the diversity. So these folks, Ben is at Upper Bremo, his wife is at Lower Bremo. Jeffrey's at Upper Bremo, his wife is at Lower Bremo. And so again, there's this mixing and matching. They go where they are needed, and that may be good for the family or it may not. But from the slaveholder's perspective, he has his own priorities. So moving on to less pretentious sites. This is Clifton in Fauquier County, and the house is out of the image here to the right, but very close by. It's only like 15 feet away. And you can see it's a log building, and it's a kitchen quarter. So the first floor is a kitchen with a very large fireplace, and that's of course one of the distinguishing features of a kitchen is the size of the fireplace and the accoutrements that are associated with cooking. And then a very strong pattern is that there's a quartering space usually above the kitchen, and likely was where folks who are working in the kitchen are living. So the cook, that kind of situation. The picture here on the right is of the quartering space above, and you'll see that it's plastered. It has a couple of windows. Of course, it has a wooden floor because it's on the second floor. It has a fireplace. And so this is, a fairly, what we would consider a fairly comfortable living space, for the enslaved occupants here. And this is one of the better preserved examples that we have. This is kind of spooky when you walk upstairs and you go into this space, because you just go, this is what we think it looked like. So again, unusual, because oftentimes, even though the building survives, it has been altered to the degree where you don't have this level, of detail. So this is a great example of the kinds of things that we can find. Another example, this is in Caroline County. So the building on the left, again, is a kitchen serving the main house on the right. And the kitchen room is the room that's closest to the main house. The picture on the lower right is of the kitchen fireplace. So again, typically what you would expect, a very large fireplace with cranes and trammel bars and all the kinds of things that you would expect to see for a kitchen that is serving the main house, okay? And then the room behind this is a quartering room. You can see the doorway leading there. And then the picture on the lower left is in the garret again. So there's a stair going up to this space. And again, you see that it's plastered, it has a fireplace, it's been whitewashed, etc. So again, it's a rare, this building is really a rare survivor. It's just not very altered at all. The kitchen has a concrete floor that undoubtedly replaced a brick floor that would have been there originally. But other than that, it really is remarkably well preserved. So a great example of that. So going on to duplexes or double quarters. Double quarter was the period term. And so it has basically two rooms on the first floor to accommodate two separate families. And then typically at least part of the garret would be set aside for living space as well. So you see here a stone building in Prince William County, then in Falmouth outside of Fredericksburg, a frame example. Heartland in Fauquier, a brick example. So again, all sorts of different materials that were used, and again in different locations. On the lower right, the Foursquare, the chimney is gone. It has collapsed, so that's why it doesn't have a chimney in the center. But it, like the Falmouth and Heartland, had a center chimney with fireplaces that serve both rooms. At Ben Lomond, it's the other option, which is end chimneys serving fireplaces from that direction. Foursquare is notable. It actually started off as a single cell building, the section on the right, and we've got dendro dates from this building, and that building dates to 1829. and then to the left of it, it was added onto. And so it started off as a single building that was, basically doubled in size. And we have a number of examples of that as well. Okay, so this is a plan of a duplex building at Sherwood Forest, which is outside of Fredericksburg. Shown on the right, it's a frame building with the classic doorways on either side leading into a first floor room, and then with stairs that led up to the garret above. And the garret is not heated. And again, sometimes they are, oftentimes they are not. So the main living area was on that first floor room. And if you refer back to the number of buildings that we found, about 110,000. Again, that's an undercount. But the population of the enslaved in Virginia in 1860 was 490,000, and it was had the largest population in the country, I believe, in 1860. So if you just do the math, that's fewer than 5 people per building. And again, I think that's a very, take that with a grain of salt, because the numbers all over the place, are pretty wonky. And clearly we know from documents that there were oftentimes more than 5 people that were living in one of these spaces. So again, it's very variable, according to the specific context. Remember this building. We'll come back to it later on. There'll be a quiz. There's going to be a quiz, You ready for the quiz? Okay. This is a log building in Nelson County that's also a duplex. Log buildings, because of their nature, oftentimes they have to be broken up. So this is a 2-bay or a 2-cell log building with a center fireplace, a center chimney and fireplaces, that divide them. And again, you can see the plan down below. Doorways coming in, staircases going up to living quarters above, and then an addition, onto the end. So in terms of, again, rarity, this is a very unusual example of a log duplex with this design. Okay, other log buildings. So these are really rare. These are 3 surviving log buildings. And the one on the upper left in Stafford County is not far from the main house. The one below, also not far. The one on the upper right is unusual. It was an actual outlying slave quarter. So it was on a plantation near Charlottesville. And it was one of a half a dozen buildings in a row that we know of that because of a map that shows these buildings. So when we were there 2 years ago, this was the only one that survived. And so dating, I haven't really talked about dating. There are virtually no slave quarters that date earlier than about 1790. They don't exist as far as we can tell. We have dendrodated the one at Foursquare I lied. The earliest one was 1789, and then the second one was 1829. So that's a very unusual building. It's one of the few that we've been able to date to the 18th century. There's a couple at Tuckahoe, Thomas Jefferson's boyhood home. But after that, there are very, very few that we can say with confidence date to the 18th century at all. So most of these buildings that you see here are dating from the 1820s on. And we've been able to dendrodate several of them to that time period. So that's something to bear in mind as well. We're looking at later examples of these buildings. Now we've got every reason to believe that we're seeing similar patterns, than that would have occurred earlier. But the actual buildings we're finding are mostly later. The lower left building is also unusual in that it was originally had an earthen floor, and it was turned into, they put a wood floor into it when they upgraded the building, after slavery days. So it's one of the few examples that we have of an earthen floor. Again, we know that was typical, especially in these log buildings, that the floors were earthen. And then one of the things that was typically done to them after the end of slavery days was to upgrade the building. And that was one of the typical ways, of doing it, which was to put in, a wooden floor. Duplexes. And so here we're talking about Maryland. So to talk a little bit about Maryland, generally speaking, the 1860 census only recorded 7,250 slave buildings in all of Maryland in 1860. Now, part of that we think is underrepresentation, because there are some counties that actually have none. And so it's very clear that the enumerators simply weren't bothering to enumerate them. But the 5 southern Maryland counties were all enumerated, and with a total of over 5,000, so an average of about 1,000 buildings. And again, we think these were standalone buildings, not wings or mixed buildings or whatever. So 5,000 buildings. And today, the number of surviving slave buildings in those 5 counties is simply tiny. It's just tiny, tiny numbers. The McPherson building here on the upper left is a double quarter, privately owned in Charles County. The picture on the upper right is at Doregan Manor up in Howard County. And behind that building, you can see there's 2 other buildings. There was a street of duplex slave quarters there. One was stone, one was frame, and one was log. And why they used all those different materials in this situation, we don't know, but they did. None of these buildings, I think survive. But there's clear evidence that these buildings were in Maryland, that there were duplexes. There were the same range of buildings in Maryland as there were in Virginia, but for whatever reason, just very few of them survive. In terms of single buildings, looking at Sodderly on the lower left here, one of very few. There's another building at Cremona that probably is a slave quarter, although it's been altered pretty significantly, so it's hard to be confident of that. There's another one up in Queen Anne County called the Hermitage, which is another frame building that was a single quarter, and it's the only survivor of a row of buildings that had been there at one time. But the numbers are just amazingly small. In terms of duplexes, of course, you have one here, a very important building, the Broome-Howard duplex, which Henry showed me through today. And it was great seeing it. It's great seeing how well cared for it is. And I applaud you for the interpretation. Because the thing about these buildings is that if it's been around for 160 years after slavery, it has gone through probably many other iterations of use since that. And one of the first and obvious ones was oftentimes they were turned into housing for free blacks who were working as tenants or farm laborers or domestic servants or whatever. And so they have a long history from that capacity. And to ignore that, I think, is doing the story a huge, injustice. And for the descendant community, I have found this is something that is something that they can really warm up to, is that it's the story of survival. It's the story of overcoming. It's 100 and some years of history, when these buildings, were serving these other purposes. And I think the interpretation at the Broome-Howard quarter is fabulous, because that's what it embraces. There's the slavery period, there's the, freedom period, and then there's the later period. And there's no, sort of sugarcoating it, but it clearly shows the building, it shows how it evolved, and it gives voice to the people, who literally gives voice to some of the people who live there. So very exciting. Sodderly, shown here, is a good example of how these buildings changed after slavery. The brick chimney that you see here, the windows, and the stair that you can't see on the interior on the left-hand picture, but you can see on the right, this is where the original stair came up into the garret on the right-hand side. All of those were either replaced or altered in some way to make the space, more accommodating for folks after slavery days. This was one of about 20 slave quarters that Julie King has identified the locations, likely locations at Sodderly. This is one of a row of at least a half a dozen slave quarters that went down the road here that still survived in the early 20th century. And when the owners, I'm not going to name the name, you all know it probably, when they acquired the property in 1914, they knocked down all but this building. And the story is that the reason that they didn't knock this building down was that it was being occupied. And so, instead of knocking it down, they also upgraded it some more. So that's the typical story for these buildings, is that they've undergone multiple iterations of change. And so part of our project has been to try to figure that out. So the first thing is, how old is this building? What was its original condition? What was its character at one time? How has it changed over time? And to try to figure that out. And so that's the exciting part of this project. Is it's a really, you've heard it many times, a detective story to try to, uncover the layers of history that we find in this building. On the right is, standing there is Dave Weir on the left and Andy Compton on the right. Historic Sodderly is currently undertaking conservation work on this building. And so Dave and Andy, this was last week, I think, they're conferring about some of the conservation issues in the building. Sodderly is also hoping to undertake archaeology. If we get money, if we get a grant, Julie King from the college here is going to work with the descendant community there to do archaeological excavations in and around the cabin for two reasons. One is to inform the ongoing restoration of the building. Again, it has had multiple floors put in. The current one is not very accurate, and so we're interested in finding out more to guide the restoration of the building, and also to recover artifacts that will tell more about the lives of the occupants, both enslaved and free. So there was a period of interest in improving slave quarters, and we've already talked about John Hartwell Cock. That was one example of that. To make these buildings more healthful, because again, this is the major investment for many of these owners, is that their enslaved workers were the most valuable element of their estate. So everything was an incentive for them to make these the best places that they could to improve that. So on the left, this is a plan for a 2-story building in Maryland, and I think this is Anne Arundel County, I think, and you can see that it's very ambitious. It's divided up into multiple rooms with gathering rooms, and it's heated by wood stoves. And wood stoves were viewed as a much better, much more economical way of heating buildings in general, but particularly slave quarters. And the one on the right is from Western Virginia, which was a plan that was put forward by an owner for a duplex slave quarter that you can see here. And she's got all sorts of yards for them to garden in and to have livestock, etc. So it was all part of this larger plan to have a better housing and a better overall context for these enslaved folks. Skipping down and moving towards the end here. So there's some good stories for preservation. The building here is in Fauquier County. It's owned by the Warrenton Antiquarian Society. It's a publicly accessed site, and it's a log building that has been sited, and it was a duplex. And you see the plan down below. You can see the 2 rooms with 2 doorways going into it. There was a center chimney, which no longer survives, but the fireplaces survive below the roof line. And so this is one of those buildings that underwent sort of the typical changes after slavery days. The doorway that's circled here, number 3, was punched in so that you could get in from one side to the other, again at Broomhoward and other places. So, instead of having two separate households, they're using the entire building, for one family. So that's one of the typical things that we see. The stair in the corner is the later stair, much more commodious than the ladder stairs that would have been there previously. And they added a kitchen wing onto the left-hand side where that doorway, entered into that. And the windows were all upgraded. Those 6/6 sash windows replaced, much smaller, not even glassed-in windows that were the original condition. So the antiquarians have paid to restore the building. You can see on the lower right, and it's open. And again, they tell the entire story. They have not tried to take it back to slavery days. They tell the whole story of the building, and it was occupied into the 1960s by a family who worked on the property. They were farm workers, and so they've done oral histories with them. They've interviewed, and so they've got great stories from them from their time period when they were living in this building as well. Another example, a brick building out in Clark County. It is a kitchen and a laundry. So the quarter space was in the garret, up above. And you can see the location near the main house here. So sort of a classic situation for a kitchen and a laundry, and then enslaved folks that are probably working, performing those tasks. Again, very well preserved. So this is in the kitchen room. So you can see the very large kitchen fireplace, and you can see that the walls have been whitewashed, have been covered many, many times, and it's remarkably intact. And then the picture on the right shows the stair that goes up to the living quarters up above, and through the doorway would have been the laundry. All again, nicely located in relation to the main house. And this is a great story because the owner, when we talked to him first, he said, "Well, I think I'm gonna redo all this, and my grandchildren need a place to stay when they come visit." And we said, "Well, we'd really prefer that you didn't do that. Not that we don't like your grandchildren, but this is really an important building." And he agreed. And so he's preserved the building, and as far as I know, that's the plan for the foreseeable future. One other example, this is in Clark County. So this is a log building, and on the left you see it nicely in good condition. We restored this building in 2015. The picture on the right shows the building before the restoration. And again, this is a sort of a classic example of the trajectory of changes to this building. So this is actually a log building with a porch, a frame porch that was added on the front in the early 20th century to accommodate the folks who were living in it at that time, who were tenant farmers and domestic servants. So when we restored it, we did not take it back to slavery days. Again, the interpretation, and on the inside, the walls have not been sort of restored. So on the interior, the story of the building is told. So on the exterior, you see it like this, and there's interpretive plaques as well. But then on the interior is the opportunity to tell that deeper story of the change of the building and the occupants. And again, the last occupant was in the 1950s, and we were able to interview her as she was sitting in her former home, which was just great. This shows that building with the siding all taken off. So you'll see here it's a log structure, 2 pents here with windows on either side. And this would be considered an improved slave building. It's got wooden floors. The rooms are relatively large. The center chimney served stoves, wood stoves, as opposed to a fireplace. It had windows. The red rectangles show the original window size and location, and then over time, they enlarged them, which is the typical thing to do, especially in log buildings. Because anywhere you have a window or a door in a log building, you're weakening the structure. because, it's just the logs. And so every place you do that, you've got to take extra care that you make sure that you don't, cause a problem there. There's a lot of buildings where you see them slumping, especially at the windows and the doors, and that's largely the reason why, because they did not take, adequate care. So anyway, so we documented this, as you can see here, did a thorough documentation of this building because we knew that we were going to restore it, and then you were not going to be able to see what the original building looked like. So, multiple ways to try to treat these structures and to try to tell their stories. And now going back to the building I asked you to remember. So this is that building. And I've not been back for a few years, so I'm sure that's on the ground at this stage. So this could have been saved. When we first saw it, it was in much better condition. The walls were not deflected. The roof was in much better shape. But over the years, the owners just elected not to do anything. It was a developer. They purchased this large tract of land, and what do you know? There's a slave building on it that has nothing to do, with the townhomes that we're planning on putting here. So, from their perspective, this was just a total, nothing that we're interested in doing with, and so that's unfortunately a very common situation. Okay, I am done. So the first thing I want to do is, again, thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Thank the property owners, 120, some of them, who have allowed us to come onto their property and to look at their buildings. Some of them a little bit more grudgingly than others. And again, we've got sort of a mixture here. Thank the students that have worked with us. Doug Sanford is my co-director of this project. We've worked hand in hand, since 2007. He was at University of Mary Washington, and so he taught several classes where students went out with him and recorded these buildings. I did similar things at the University of Maryland. And then the colleagues and other folks who have helped us, who've told us about buildings, or who have gotten us access. So at BREMO, where we're working right now, local Tricia Johnson, who's the head of the Fluvanna County Historical Society, it's all up to her. She contacted us and she said, I think we've got some good buildings in Fluvanna, and I'm going to try to get you in there. And she did. And so without her, we would not have been able to do that. So again, thanks to all the different folks that have helped with this.
Question.
Yes.
Are any of the state historic preservation offices in Maryland or Virginia in any way planning to work on this resource?
So in Maryland, I guess I didn't mention it, that the Maryland Historical Trust paid for a survey of slave buildings that is finished now. The report is not out yet. And so, unfortunately, and that's one of the things that has exposed this question about how many buildings there are, because they sought to find and document 10 buildings, which is a pretty modest, frankly, goal. And they had a hard time. They had a hard time doing it. And they only were able to come up with a very few, standalone buildings. So they have supported that, and that is aimed at being a precursor to trying to do more to preserve these buildings. The big challenge here is that, like so many buildings, there's just not, funding is not available. And VDHR, they're very interested in our project. I don't know if they have the will to, I don't know what's going to happen. But over the last 2 years, things have changed, which is a very positive thing. And as more descendant groups have become involved and have expressed their interest in this, that is a more powerful thing than a couple of white professor types, doing our thing. When people show that they really care about this stuff, I think that's helpful in making a difference. So I'm certainly hoping that there will be good news. Hoping there'll be good news. Other questions? Love to have questions. Okay, the quiz is going to come. No questions. That everybody knows everything. That means that there's going to be the quiz. Yes.
Do you see differences in the architecture based on the type of plantation? Like, is it different at a tobacco plantation and a sugar plantation? Or does that not really affect?
Well, first of all, in this part of the world, it's tobacco plantations and primarily, mixed grains, and as time goes on, tobacco, is not totally supplanted, but obviously other things become important. Frankly, we don't see a whole lot of difference in that because they're still in the fields. Tobacco is more labor intensive than grain agriculture. And so, of course, what we do see is that large slaveholders begin to divest. And so, as Virginia becomes a major exporter of enslaved folks in this time period. So they're sending them south to Cotton Belt land, where they're still doing very labor-intensive stuff. So, that's just a general pattern, and certainly Maryland is part of that as well, of that happening during this time period. So ultimately, that would have an impact. That would mean fewer buildings. That could have a major, but it did not to the point that we see that at this time. Also, I did not mention that both of these colonies are primarily agricultural, but that doesn't mean that there weren't important other activities that were based on slavery. So Virginia had a big iron industry. Maryland did too, of course. Iron industry, and those the workers there, are enslaved, and so and hiring out. Is a major activity. A lot of these large slaveholders, over time, they don't have the need for all that labor. And so one avenue that they can take is to hire these folks out for a yearly basis. And that was the typical thing. So on a yearly contract. And so we know from studies of the ironworks in Western Virginia, the ironwork managers would every year go out and try to hire workers to come and work in the ironworks. And they had their own, skilled artisans, but they always needed, other folks. And so that's typical to do that. And so what does that mean for where they're living? We haven't found a lot of examples of that we can point to, but that would be kind of a classic situation where if you're hiring, 20 guys to come work on the ironworks, you're not going to put them up in, what are the accommodations? And unfortunately, we don't have enough of that evidence. A lot of folks are being hired in cities. So in Richmond, for example, we know that there were, a lot of enslaved folks who are being hired to work in the cities. And this leads to kind of neighborhoods that are established, where African Americans are living, and that's a real interesting that unfortunately doesn't survive much. There's documentation about that, there's descriptions about that, but we haven't found any buildings that seem to relate to that activity at this stage. Yes.
A question about some of the buildings after slavery, and then some of them having these modifications and upgrades. Is there a way of being able to tell, any kind of documentation that shows what, instances of where you have the property owner instigating this, or the families that are living there kind of, are doing that work, being given permission to do their own modification?
Mm-hmm. We don't really have that precise information, really. We've got some examples of properties where freed, enslaved, continued to work there and live there, and modifications occurred. But unfortunately, we don't have, I would certainly surmise that they were important in those changes, but how that actual process occurred, we just don't have that evidence. Yes.
Tying into the question about the styles of structures, you said obviously you said you don't see the difference between tobacco or sugar plantation, but what about between the Tidewater and out west, like in the Shenandoah Valley or the Piedmont, and then also with wealth of the owners?
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So two parts. So yeah, so definitely geographical differences. Where there's stone, you tend to see stone buildings. And so in Western Maryland, in Washington County, for example, there are a number of surviving slave buildings. None of them are standalone buildings. They're, kitchens, blacksmiths, whatever. So we still don't have that, but it does have sort of a distinctive architectural style that I think derives from those two facts. They're building in stone, so they're using sort of regional stone masonry techniques, right? And then the type of building that they are, lends itself to some of those sort of specific changes. Wealth. So we tend to think that these folks lived in specified spaces of their own, and that's not true, especially earlier on. I think as the 19th century goes on, it becomes more so, especially as families become very important. And, that's part of enslavers like families because they are generating revenue. They're generating, folks that they own. And so at a certain point, it becomes very clear to enslavers that is a real benefit that they should promote. So that's whole idea about more improved quartering, that's part of that, is that it's to support family, units in that. And so again, that tends to be wealthier folks. Again, as I mentioned before, the number of enslaved that a typical slave owner had was five or fewer. And so that means, if you only have a couple, three people, you have more options of where they can live. And in the 18th century, studies have shown that many more enslaved were living in the main house in sort of unspecified spaces. So again, we tend to think of everybody's got their little space, but that is not true early on, and I think it becomes less common as time goes on, but that's still the case. And there's plenty of documents of of individual folks that they have no specified, they're living in the back hall or somewhere else, and it's not really known. But on small holdings, the intimacy between the family, the enslaver, and the enslaved, as I think I alluded to, is much closer. So George Washington, he has 300 enslaved folks. How many of them does he know? Does he see on a regular basis? It's going to be the ones that are at the Mansion House Farm. All those other folks out there, they're in a different world. And that's one of the things that scholars have found is that these large plantations with large enslaved communities are important culturally because they've got a body of folks together. It's a community, and at places like Mount Vernon, there are families there that are multiple generations, and so there's a cohesion, there that you're just not going to find somewhere where there's just a couple of individuals, living out there. And so, there's references to, different activities and that show up in, like at Mount Vernon, there's a guy who's known as I forget his title, but he's basically he's a preacher, and he clearly has status within the enslaved community, how he's referred to. And that's because of those kinds of relationships. You're not going to build that up, somewhere else. So I think that's an interesting aspect of this, is that the role, that these communities, had in the larger development, of African American, culture, I think is important and hard to get at, but I think is clearly there. Yes.
So you mentioned that there's
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to speak up. I'm half deaf.
scarcity of surviving standalone structures prior to, I think it was 1820 or so.
Mhm.
Is that due to the preservation bias that they just don't exist anymore or got destroyed or altered in that time? or is it due to either changes in how plantations were, where the layout was, or the living arrangements of enslaved people in the time period before, when you're getting more preservation of structures?
Right. So I think that the 1820 date is that sort of after 1820, we expect to see more standalone buildings. You know, that you know, families, and I mean, that just seems to be the case. And so, you know, so given that, you know, the lack of them is, you know, kind of remarkable. And I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I don't know why Maryland and Virginia would be different in that, but based on our sample, it seems to be the case. I mean, we have 123 buildings. I'm confident there's another 123 buildings out there. I mean, I think we could continue doing this, you know, for a long time before we, you know, exhausted these buildings. I mean, there may be diminishing returns in terms of the preservation, you know, the integrity of the buildings, you know, and we've not documented several buildings that they're just so changed that there's just nothing, you know, we can do. I mean, we take a picture of it and that's sort of as far as it goes, but it's just been totally gutted, you know, turned into, I mean, they get turned into all kind of stuff. You know, so I'm rambling. Did I answer your question? I don't know, but I think it is the survival. I mean, they should be there, I guess is my point. You know, is that there should have been 1,000 standalone buildings in St. Mary's County in 1860. And if you've got 5, then there's something wrong with those numbers. And I don't know the answer to why it is. Yes.
Dennis, do you run into any housing for free Black communities pre-Civil War? Because there are, so you know, quite a few.
Sure.
Wondering if any of that, because Hearth and Home,
Sure. Yeah, George McDaniel's book. Right.
thinking of the Ben's Creek up in Calvert County and stuff like that, that were pre-Civil War free.
Right.
And I don't know how many of those have been recorded and.
Mhm. Yeah, well, you know, George McDaniel's book was great.
Yeah, but it's done a long time ago.
Yeah, 1980. So, you know, I mean, frankly, our focus.
They're still standing, but a couple of them are, you know, they're gone.
Okay. Well, I mean, frankly, our focus has not been Maryland, so
Yeah.
I can cap out. I can cap out in that way. Yeah, but there are, but you know, and those oftentimes those sites, we know where they are, but I don't know of any structures that survive from them. You know, Smoketown is, you know, sort of the typical name that is given to these communities. And you see them on the maps. I mean, there's bunches of them out there. I've never found one that had anything intact, you know, that they're archaeological sites, as far as I can tell. And in Maryland, I just don't know. You know, and George's book is great, and I don't know if somebody should, you know, go out there and find out how many of those buildings, you know, still survive. I don't know. Maybe somebody already has, but if they have, I don't know.
Anybody's done.
That's a job for young people. Any more? One last question? Okay.
Well, Dennis, we thank
One more. We have one more.
Have you ever come across any like recreational buildings, or is it primarily just like residential and working spaces?
That are for enslaved folks?
Yeah, kind of like you mentioned a preacher. Was there like any religious centers for these larger communities that you guys came across, or was it kind of were those activities done in like the private spaces of their homes?
I can't say that we found anything that we think was a specialized use, you know, for enslaved folks. You know, and that's the big mystery, and that's of course the big challenge here, is that, you know, buildings are buildings, and they're important, and they're evocative spaces, but even the best preserved one doesn't have what you want, which is the stuff. So, I mean, if you're trying to understand the people that live there, which is of course what this is all about, it's just hard, you know, and things like religious belief and all of that, and these cultural, you know, things that we know are going on within this community. You know, architecture is frankly just not very well suited to understand that. You know, you'll learn more from looking at the WPA narratives from the 1930s, you know, when they're interviewing, you know, slaves, freed slaves and descendants of that, you know, than you will by looking at buildings. I hate to say it, but, you know. And it's a good thing that those materials are out there as well.
Well, Dennis, we want to thank you for your lecture and thank you and Doug for persisting with this important project.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, everybody.